A woman 3 times his width stepped off the train. Skinny farmer carried her bags, smiling. The bag was heavier than it had any right to be. I know that because I lifted it. Both of them. Big trunk too, the kind with brass hasps gone green and a leather strap that had been repaired twice, different color leather each time. She stood on the platform and watched me hoist it, and she didn't offer to help, and she didn't thank me, and she didn't smile. Just watched, like she was deciding something. That was Dora. I'd been standing at that platform for 20 minutes before the train arrived. Wore my good shirt. The collar was clean because I'd washed it the night before and dried it on the fence post and ironed it that morning with the flat iron I'd had since my mother died, the one with the chipped wooden handle. I'd picked up that iron so many times I didn't need to look to find it. Just reached. Like muscle remembers things the mind lets go. I was 44 years old. I had a farm of 160 acres that was worth something. The north section had good water, a creek that ran even in August when the rest of the county was dust. And I had a house that needed a second set of hands, and I had a dog named Frank who would not stay off the furniture, and I had not been in the company of a woman for something like 9 years. Not for lack of trying the first few years. Margaret Purvis let me court her for 6 months and then married a cattle buyer from Wichita. Clara Edens danced with me at the Harvest Social 2 years running and then didn't come the 3rd year, and somebody told me she'd gone back east to her sisters. A woman named Adeline had written to me through the agency the previous spring. We exchanged 4 letters, long ones from my side. She stopped writing. I never knew why. The agency sent me Dora's letter in January. She'd written it herself, the handwriting not pretty but clear, none of that leaning forward slant that women's letters sometimes have like there in a hurry to please you. Hers went straight across the page. She was a widow from outside of Davenport. She was 41. She had run a household and a garden and knew how to put up preserves, and had kept books for her late husband's hardware business for 12 years. She wrote, and this is the part I read twice, she wrote that she was a practical woman and not a vain one, and that whoever she married would know exactly who he was getting before she arrived. I read that and I thought, all right, that's a woman who won't surprise you badly. I wrote back, she wrote again. We went back and forth for 2 months. She asked about the water rights and whether I carried debt and what I did when the wheat didn't come in. I told her the truth on all 3. She told me about her husband, Chester, who had died of a burst appendix 3 winters back, and about her son who was grown and gone to Oregon, and about how she had sold the house and most of what was in it, and had no intention of being a burden to her boy. She said she was not looking for romance, she was looking for a partner, and she hoped I understood the difference. I wrote back and said I understood perfectly. She was the 4th woman I'd written to through that agency. The other 3 I'd tried to impress. With Dora, I just told the truth and let it sit. So that February morning I was at the platform with my good shirt and my wagon and the horse I'd brushed the night before, which he did not appreciate, and the train came in and people got off, and then she stepped down. She was a big woman, wide through the shoulders, wide through the middle, solid in the way of a person who has worked hard all her life and eaten enough to do it. She had a gray traveling dress that was plain and clean, and a hat that was not fashionable but was tied on sensibly against the wind. Her face was round and not beautiful, but it was a face that looked like it had made up its mind about things and could be talked to. I walked over and said, "You must be Dora Hessler." She looked me up and down. She was not unkind about it, just thorough. She said, "You're Elias Marsh." I said I was. She said, "You're thinner than I pictured." I said most people were. She didn't smile at that, but something moved at the corner of her mouth. Then she turned and pointed at her bags without a word, and I understood, and I went and got them. My neighbor, Roy Tidball, was there that day. He was picking up a crate of machine parts. He saw me carrying those bags, and he saw Dora, and he got an expression on his face that I did not like. Not cruel, Roy wasn't cruel, just amused. The way a man gets when something confirms what he already suspected about you. He called out, "Got your mail-order bride, Elias," and laughed in the way that men laugh when they're laughing at you but want it to seem like they're laughing with you. I set the bags in the wagon and helped Dora up to the bench. Her hand in mine was thick and dry and strong, not the hand of a woman who'd ever worried about her hands. I did not say anything to Roy. We drove out of town and I showed her the country. It was February, so there wasn't much to show. Gray sky, gray fields, the creek line marked by the bare cottonwoods. I told her what it looked like in spring, the wheat coming up green, the way the light lay on the north section in the morning. She listened without speaking much. She asked one question about the creek, whether it had flooded the near field in living memory. I said once, 1881, but we'd regraded since. She nodded, said that's good. We got to the farmhouse and I showed her around. The kitchen, the 2 rooms upstairs, the root cellar, the barn. Frank the dog followed us the whole way trying to get her to pay attention to him. She did, eventually. She scratched his ears and said, he sleeps inside, doesn't he? It wasn't a question. I said he did. She said, I thought so. She went upstairs and unpacked her trunk, and I did not see her again until supper, which I had started before she came down. She looked at what I was doing, and without speaking, she moved me aside and took over. The food was better than mine, not by a little. We ate, and she asked me 3 questions about the farm, and I asked her one about Davenport, and that was most of the conversation. When we were done, she washed the dishes, and I dried them, and we put them away without discussing who was going to do which, and somehow we managed it without getting in each other's way. That was the first evening. I had made up the downstairs room for her. She had not asked, and I had not explained. She went in and closed the door, and that was that. I lay in my room upstairs and listened to the wind and thought that this was either the best decision I'd ever made or a complete disaster, and I could not yet tell which. In the morning, she was up before me. I came downstairs and the stove was going and coffee was on and she was outside. I looked out the window and she was walking the north field, her coat on, her boots already muddy, just walking the ground, reading it. I watched her for a minute before I went out. She was standing at the edge of the creek bank when I caught up to her. She'd broken off a stalk of last year's wheat that had been left standing and was rolling it between her fingers. She handed it to me when I reached her and pointed at the far bank. She said that's where the water was. You can see the line in the clay. I looked, she was right. Old flood mark 8 feet up the bank, right where I'd said. I hadn't looked at it in years. She'd been on the farm for about 14 hours. She said, you going to plant this section? I said, wheat, like always. She said, have you thought about corn? She said the soil down at the creek edge would hold moisture better, and if I moved the wheat up to the dry section and put corn down here, I might get a better yield on both. She said she'd seen it done on a farm near Davenport. I thought about it. I said I hadn't. She said, think about it. She walked back toward the house. I stood there looking at the flood mark and thinking about corn. We got married on a Saturday in March. Pastor Hank at the Lutheran church in town. Roy Tidball was there. He'd brought his wife, Pearl, who was a small woman who had never liked Roy much, and showed it. Pearl shook Dora's hand with both of hers and held it a long time and looked at her with something that wasn't pity, just recognition. Like she was glad someone else was now in the county who knew what it meant to make a practical marriage and carry it like you meant it. Roy shook my hand and said, well, you did it. I said I did. He looked at Dora across the church, who was talking to Pastor Hank in a straightforward way about something, and he said, she's not exactly what I'd have expected. I said no. He waited like I was going to say more. I didn't. We had supper afterward at the farm. Dora cooked. Pearl brought a cake. Roy ate a lot and said very little, which meant he didn't have much to disapprove of, and for Roy that was about as high as praise got. What I am trying to get at, and I am not a man who is good at getting at things, is that it was a practical arrangement that became something else. But not fast, not dramatic. There was no moment I can point to and say that was when it changed. It was more like the ground shifting under you, and you don't know it's shifted until you notice you're standing in a different place. In April, she planted a kitchen garden behind the house in a spot I'd always used for scrap wood. She didn't ask. She moved the wood to the barn and turned the soil and planted it. I was going to say something about where I'd keep the wood, but then I didn't because I looked at where she'd planted it, and it was the right spot, the south-facing one that got light all day. I hadn't planted a garden there because I hadn't thought of it. I moved the wood. I built a linta for it against the barn. Took me 2 days, and it was better than stacking it in the open, which is what I'd been doing for 20 years. In May, she came out to the north field when I was planting. I'd gone with wheat. I'd thought about her corn idea, and I wasn't ready to change that much in one season. She stood at the edge and watched me work for a while, not saying anything. Then she went back to the house. That evening she said, I shouldn't have told you what to plant. I said it was a good idea. She said it was, but it's your land. I was out of line. I said you weren't. I'm going to try the corn next year on the creek section. She looked at me. She said, "You don't have to." I said, "I know, but I'm going to." Something in her face then. It wasn't soft. Dora's face wasn't built for soft, but it settled, like something she'd been holding on to loosened its grip a little. June, the wheat came up, and it was a good stand. I walked the rows and felt the relief of it, the way you feel relief at something you've been depending on all your life and it comes through again. There's no gratitude in it, not exactly. More like you've been waiting for the ground to give out under you and it hasn't yet. Dora made supper and I came in dirty, and she had put a basin of water out on the porch without my asking, which she'd started doing when she saw I always had to go back for it. I washed and came inside, and she said the wheat looked good from the window. I said it did. She said, "You look like it surprised you." I said it always surprised me. She said, "Even after how long?" I said 22 years. She shook her head, not in a pitying way, more like she was putting something in its proper place in her mind. We ate, and after she said, "There was a letter from my son. He's well." She said it plain, not needing me to respond, just telling me because I was there and he was her son, and that was enough reason to say it. I said, "Good." She said, "He's got a daughter now, born in May." I said, "Congratulations." She said, "He'll never come back. I've known it a while." I didn't say anything to that. There wasn't anything to say. She said, "I'm not telling you because I want you to do something about it. I'm telling you because you're the person I tell things to now." I sat with that for a minute. She had said it the same way she said everything. Level, not performing the emotion, just carrying it, like the weight of a thing she'd picked up and would not set down. I said, "All right." She said, "All right." That summer Frank bit Roy Tidball. I should say Roy had it coming. He'd ridden over to borrow my post-hole digger, and Frank went for his ankle and got a good piece of his boot before I called him off. Roy stood there looking at the tooth marks in the leather, and then at me, and I could see him deciding whether to make something of it. He said, "That dog's a menace, Elias." I said, "He's protective." Roy said, "Of what?" "A post-hole digger." I said, "Of the place." Roy looked toward the house, where Dora had come to the door to see what the commotion was. He had the same look he'd had at the train station. But it was different now, the way a man's look changes when he's realized a thing he didn't expect to have to admit. He said, "She doing all right, settling in?" I said she was. He said, "Pearl likes her." I said I knew. Pearl had come over 3 times in 3 months, which was more than she'd been over in the previous 3 years. Roy picked up the post-hole digger. He said, "You seem," and then he stopped. I said, "What?" He said, "You seem better." I said I didn't know what he meant. He said, "Yeah, you do." He rode off. I stood there watching him go, and I thought, maybe I do. It was July when I cut my hand. I was working on the combine, which is always where a man cuts himself, and the blade took a long slice across my left palm. Not deep enough to kill me, but deep enough to need attention. I wrapped it in my shirt and walked to the house, and when I came in, Dora looked at it, and her face did not change, but she moved fast. She had it cleaned and wrapped before I'd sat down all the way. She cut the shirting into strips and bound it tight, and she worked without speaking, which was her way, but her hands were careful. That's the word. Deliberate in the way of someone who is being careful with something that matters. I sat and she worked, and the kitchen was quiet and it was hot, the way July kitchens are, and I could smell the iron tang of the blood and the lye soap she was using, and underneath that something that was just her. The way a person smells in summer. She tied off the bandage and sat back and looked at it. She said, "Keep that out of the dirt." I said I would. She said, "You won't." I said, "Probably not." She looked at the bandage, then she looked at me. Not long. Dora didn't hold a look longer than she needed to, but long enough. She said, "Be more careful." There was nothing in it except the plain words and the way she said them, which was the same way she said everything. But I knew, and you know things sometimes without being able to say how, I knew that she meant something more than the hand, that she was telling me something she didn't have a way to say except through the ordinary words. I said I would be. She got up and went back to what she was doing before I came in bleeding, and I sat there with my hand wrapped in her careful bandaging and the kitchen hot and the dog asleep in the corner, and I thought about what it was to be seen, not praised, Not desired. Seen. Just this man, his worth, plain as day, and her knowing it without needing to make a speech of it. I don't know if she loved me then. I know I was beginning to. Harvest came early that year, last week of August, which was lucky because the rain came in September and kept coming. We worked the whole thing in a week, which I couldn't have done alone. Dora drove the wagon. I had done it myself for years, hired a hand when I could afford one, done without when I couldn't. Having her there, it wasn't that she made it faster, though she did. It was that the work was shared. Some part of the weight of it went off me, not the physical weight, the other kind. The last day of harvest I came in and she had supper ready and a bottle of whiskey on the table, which was not something we usually had, and she poured 2 glasses and set one in front of me and sat down. She said, "Good year." I said it was. She said, "The corn idea's going to be better." I laughed. I don't think I'd laughed at the table in years. She looked at me when I laughed. There was something in her face that wasn't quite a smile, but was in the neighborhood. She said, "What?" I said, "Nothing. It's just you're right about everything." She said, "Not everything." I said, "About the farm you are." She said, "About the farm I might be. We'll see." She picked up her glass and I picked up mine and she said, "To the farm." And I said it back and we drank. It wasn't a toast that needed words after it. September was the rain and October was the mud, and in November the first hard frost came, and I found a heifer that had calved in the night in the cold. I got the calf inside and worked on her for an hour before she came through, and by then my hands were past cold and had gotten to the stage that feels like burning. I came in and Dora was at the stove, and she took my hands in hers without being asked and held them, pressing them between her palms. I stood there and let her. The heat came back into my fingers slow and hard. She kept holding them, her hands large and warm, and neither of us said anything. The dog was asleep on the chair he was not supposed to be on. The lamp was low. Outside the frost was building on the window, and inside it was warm and quiet, and she was holding my hands in hers, and I thought, this is what it is. This plain, ordinary thing is exactly what it is. I said, "Thank you." She said, After a while she let go and I made coffee, and she went back to what she was doing, and that was all. But when I woke up in the night, which I sometimes did that year, because for the first time in a long time there was something worth waking up to think about, when I woke up in the night and lay there in the dark house, I thought about her holding my hands in the lamplight, and I thought, she knows what she married. She came out here knowing. And she's still here, and she's going to keep being here. And there's a woman in this house who has decided that Elia's marsh is worth the trouble of it. And no one has ever, not in the way that holds, decided that before. That's a thing a man can live on. The 2nd December, she found the photograph. I'd left it out by accident. It was in a tin box I kept in the bottom of the wardrobe, and I'd gotten it out to look for a document and left the lid ajar. She was cleaning, and she found it. She brought it to me that evening and set it on the table. It was a photograph of a woman, young, dark-haired, sitting very straight. She said, "Who is this?" I said her name was Frances. She waited. I said we were going to be married. That was 1879. She was 22. Dora sat down. She looked at the photograph and not at me. I said she got sick in the fall, fever. She was gone in 3 weeks. Dora said nothing. I said I went ahead and bought the farm anyway. I don't know why. I think I thought if I built the thing there'd be some reason to stay in it. She picked up the photograph, looked at it, set it down. She said, "You kept the photograph in a tin box at the bottom of the wardrobe." I said yes. She said, "For how long?" I said 23 years. She sat with that. Then she said, "You should put it somewhere you can see it if you want to." I said you wouldn't mind. She looked at me then, that direct level look she had. She said, "Elias, she was your life before you had a life. I'm not in competition with a 22-year-old girl who died in 1879. I didn't say anything. She said, "Put it on the shelf in the sitting room." I said, "All right." She said she looked kind. I said she was. Dora said, "Good," then put it on the shelf. She got up and went to bed, and I sat there for a while with the photograph in my hand and the lamp burning down, and I thought about what kind of woman does that. What kind of woman says put it where you can see it? Not because she doesn't feel anything, but because she's large enough to hold the feeling and still do the right thing. Large in every sense of the word, Dora. I put the photograph on the shelf. That winter the storms were bad. 3 weeks in January when the temperature did not get above single digits, and the wind came from the north and didn't stop. I lost 2 calves and a section of fence, and we burned through the woodpile faster than I'd cut for. I was outside every day in it, and I came in every evening with the cold deep in me the way it gets when it's been there for hours, past feeling like cold, just a weight. She kept the stove going. She made bean soup, the same pot kept going for days, added to and taken from. She brought wool socks up from somewhere, a pair I didn't know I had, and left them by the stove for when I came in. One night in the worst of it, a Wednesday, I came in and I was, I don't know, not all right. I sat down at the table and I didn't take my coat off and I just sat there. The cold and the dead calves and the fence and the sheer grinding loneliness of a hard winter, the 20 years of it before she came, the doing of it alone, it all sat on me at once. She put a bowl in front of me, soup. Then she sat down across from me. She didn't ask what was wrong. She just sat there, which was what I needed, someone to sit there. After a while she said, "It'll break." I said, "It always breaks." She said, "Yes." I said, 23 years of this, you'd think it would get easier. She said, "Some things don't. That's not the same as them being unbearable." I looked at her across the table, her face in the lamplight, round and plain and tired from her own long days and not asking for anything, just sitting there. I said, "I'm glad you came." She said, "I know." I said, I'm glad, not just for the farm." She looked at me for a moment, then she said, "I know that too." She didn't say she was glad she'd come, not in so many words. But she reached across the table and put her hand over mine, just for a moment. Then she went back to her soup. I ate. Spring came and we planted the corn on the creek section. Her idea finally done. I'd been slow about it, the way I was slow about changing things that had worked, even when they could have worked better. The corn came up and it was a good stand, and she was right about the moisture at the creek edge. It wasn't even close. I stood in that section in July and looked at those stalks, and I thought about her at the creek bank in February, 2 days after she'd arrived, reading the ground like she'd known it her whole life. I went and found her. She was in the kitchen garden pulling weeds. She didn't look up. I said, "The corn." She said, "Good." I said, "Good." She went on weeding. I stood at the edge of the garden. She said, "You going to stand there, or are you going to help?" I got down and pulled weeds. We worked side by side for a while. The garden was doing well. She'd put in things I wouldn't have thought to put in. Rows of it, straight and tended. The whole south side of the house transformed from the place where I'd stacked scrap wood for 20 years. She said, "You've got good soil, Elias." I said I knew. She said, "Some farmers take it for granted." I said I tried not to. She said, "I know, that's why it's good." It was a plain thing to say. But she wasn't talking only about the soil, and we both knew it, and neither of us said so because we didn't have to. I am 68 years old now. That was Lord 23 years ago. 24. I have told this story before. Badly. To my son-in-law who married Dora's granddaughter, who came out to see us one summer and asked how we'd gotten together, and I said, "She stepped off the train and she was the most capable-looking woman I'd ever seen, and I carried her bags, and I'm not a fool." He laughed. He said, "That's it." I said that was about the size of it. It isn't, of course, but how do you explain to a young man what it means to spend 20 years as a man nobody thought much of, and then have a woman come into your life who looks at you, not through you, not past you, looks at you and decides, "Yes, that one. That's the one I'll put my name next to. That's the one I'll hold this ground with." How do you explain what it does to a man to be chosen like that? You can't, you just carry it. Dora is in the sitting room right now. I can hear her. She's got the grandchildren over, Dora's granddaughter's kids, 2 of them, and they are being what children are, which is loud and insistent and heedless of anything except what they want in the next 5 minutes. She handles them the same way she handles everything. Level, patient, not needing them to be other than they are. She told the older one yesterday that she'd made a mistake and to go fix it, and the boy went and fixed it without arguing, because you didn't argue with Dora. Not because she raised her voice, because she meant what she said. Frank died years ago. There've been 2 dogs since. The current one is called Merle. He still sleeps on the furniture. The photograph of Francis is on the shelf in the sitting room. It's been there for 23 years. Dora dusts it. The cornfield is still on the creek section. It's been there every year since that second spring. Good yield most years. The soil does hold the moisture, the way she said. I go out sometimes early in the morning and walk the north field the way she walked it that first February morning. I don't know what I'm looking for. The same thing she was looking for, maybe, reading the ground, trying to understand what you have. I understand what I have. I am a man who is a long time overlooked, and a long time alone, and a plain-looking practical woman stepped off a train and looked me up and down, and decided I was worth the trouble of a life. And she has been trouble, and I have been trouble, and the farm has been trouble, and it has all been worth every day of it. She is in the other room. She is laughing now at something one of the children did. I don't know what, but I can hear it. It is not a pretty laugh, Dora's laugh. It is a real one, which is better. I am going in there. That's all.